She arrived as a bride, but she was met at the station by 7 black children. The groom was dead. What she did next, no one expected. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching this video from. The heat clung to everything, thick and unmoving, as if the air itself had given up trying to breathe. The train hissed to a stop at the dry and splintering platform of Rosewood Junction, a station in name only, made up of a fading sign, a single bench warped by sun and rain, and a shack that once might have housed a telegraph machine, but now held nothing more than shadows. The wheels groaned and the engine let out a final gasp, like even it regretted arriving. Eleanor Hale stepped down from the last car, her gloved hand gripping the worn handle of her second trunk, while the first waited beside her, dust already claiming its corners. Her boots, polished that morning in Memphis, crunched on gravel that had not seen rain in weeks. The hem of her travel dress swept dry earth and caught small bristles of burr grass. She looked around the empty platform, blinking against the sharp sun that washed out the color of everything it touched. There was no one waiting. No man with a sign bearing her name, no wagon drawn by dusty horses, no white hat tipping in recognition, just the moaning wind and the long, flat stretch of pine and cotton country yawning into the distance. Her heart beat slower, thick as syrup. Surely he was late. Trains didn't always run on time, and neither did people out here. It was the South, after all. Everything moved slower, they told her, even grief. Her name was Eleanor Hale. She had no family left, no dowry, and no fortune. Only 2 trunks, a letter, and the weight of 31 years lived more alone than not. She had answered a mail-order marriage ad placed by a widower named James Bell, a man whose penmanship was uneven but whose words had dripped with kindness and practical promises. He had spoken of a home on a hill, of a roof that didn't leak, of a warm bed and hot meals. He said he had land, not much, but enough to work, and that he was looking for a woman not just to marry, but to help raise a few children I've taken in. Eleanor had imagined orphans, maybe 3 or 4, taken in from a neighboring widow or cousin lost to the war. She imagined a man with rough hands, maybe slow to smile, but steady, honest. The kind of man who, if he said the house was small, meant it, but also meant it would keep the rain out. The kind who said, "You won't be alone," and meant it like a vow, not a hope. But there was no James Bell, no sign of life at all. She pressed the folded letter against her chest as though she might will the words to manifest the man who wrote them. Her throat ached with thirst and heat. The train behind her hissed again, doors beginning to close. She turned as if to call to the conductor, perhaps to delay her departure by another stop, to delay this mistake. But then she saw the boy. He stood barefoot in the dirt, maybe 10 years old, skinny as a scarecrow and just as still. He wore a shirt too large, rolled at the sleeves, and his trousers hung by a length of rope tied at the waist. His hair was cropped short, his face dry and smudged with dust, his eyes deep brown and too old for his years. He was squinting at her like he'd been expecting her, but didn't quite believe she was real. "You, Eleanor Hale?" he asked. The name felt foreign on the air, made heavier by his voice. She hesitated, her mouth dry. "Yes," she managed, the word catching on her tongue. He nodded once. Pause, dead. The words dropped between them like a stone in dry soil. They didn't make sense at first. She blinked. "What?" "Died 2 days ago," the boy said, like it was the weather. "Snake bit. We buried him yesterday. I'm Sam." Eleanor's grip on her trunk tightened until her knuckles whitened. She didn't know whether to laugh, cry, or scream. This was a mistake. There had to be another James Bell somewhere nearby, another station, another day, but no, the boy pointed at her letter like he'd seen it before. "He said you were coming," Sam continued. "Wrote that letter after he got bit. Said maybe you'd still come anyway. Said if anyone could handle it, it'd be you." Her vision stung, from the sun or the sudden twist in her chest. She couldn't tell which. How many of you are there?" "7, Sam said. "I'm the oldest." "7 children?" Her voice cracked. "Well, 6 now that Jenny's gone," he said plainly. "She died last winter, but the rest of us are still here." His eyes flicked to the departing train behind her, then back to her. "We don't got anyone else. The baby's still nursing." The train let out a final moan and lurched forward. Eleanor turned her head just enough to watch it disappear down the tracks, trailing smoke like a sigh. She looked at her trunks, heavy, awkward, full of her past, and then at Sam, barefoot and waiting. The air around her vibrated with silence. The world was still. "Where's the house?" she asked. Sam lifted one skinny arm and pointed past the trees beyond a low ridge. "It's small," he said. "So am I." He didn't smile, just walked to one trunk, heaved it up with a practiced effort, and started down the path. Eleanor followed, each step unsure, the dust clinging to her hem and the heat pressing on her like the weight of 1,000 unsaid questions. She had come to marry a man. She had arrived to meet a ghost and 7 children who now looked at her like the last fence post before the wind scattered them. The house wasn't much to look at. 1 room wide, leaning slightly to one side, with a slanted porch and a door that didn't sit straight on its hinges. The chimney looked like it had been built by a prayer, bricks crumbling and patched with mud. Chickens wandered aimlessly in the yard, 3, maybe 4, skinny, missing feathers. There were no flowers, no garden, only a shallow well and a few stumps that might have once been chairs. Inside, the air smelled of old ash, boiled beans, and cloth that hadn't seen water in weeks. Eleanor stepped inside and paused. 6 pairs of eyes stared back at her from a wooden table, each child more hollow than the next. A 7th was asleep in a wooden crate by the fire, bundled in a patchwork quilt. The rest were silent, bowls in front of them as if supper was a ghost they had learned to wait for. Sam dropped her trunk beside the hearth with a thud, then pointed to the head of the table. That was Pa's chair. Eleanor didn't move. "Then it stays empty." Sam nodded. She set her satchel down gently and stepped forward. A girl with braids and dirt-smudged cheeks rose slowly, holding a spoon like a weapon. "I'm Ruth," she said. "I stir things. Mama used to, before she bled out after Jonah." Her words were flat, too old. Eleanor looked into the pot, a thin stew, mostly water, 2 floating beans, and a single pale potato sliced so thin it was barely visible. She swallowed the knot in her throat. "You cooked this?" "When we can." Eleanor rolled up her sleeves. "Let's start again." She added water from her canteen, crushed dry herbs from her bag, and slipped in the piece of salted pork she'd hidden from the conductor. The smell began to change. The silence shifted. Even the baby stirred. She ladled into mismatched bowls and handed them out one by one. "Eat slow," she said. "Let your stomach remember it." The children obeyed without a word. Ruth blinked fast like she didn't know if crying was allowed. Eleanor didn't sit. She leaned against the doorframe and watched them eat, letting her own hunger knot inside her. This meal wasn't for her. It was a line drawn in the dust, a promise unspoken. After, they washed in a tin bucket behind the house. Sam lingered in the chair by the hearth, not speaking. Eleanor sat on the porch, where the wind cooled her skin and the stars blinked wide and sharp. She hadn't just inherited 7 orphans. She had stepped into a house full of unfinished hearts. And that supper, that small, strange supper, had been the first stitch in mending them. Somewhere, deep in the quiet, she heard her own heart whisper, "You didn't come for love. But maybe you came for something bigger." Morning came slow and unsure, as if even the sun hesitated to rise over the brittle roof of the Bell homestead. Eleanor woke, not in a bed, but on a straw mat near the hearth, where warmth from the fading embers still reached her bones. Her body ached in unfamiliar places, the kind of soreness that comes not from travel but from the weight of watching 7 children eat like it might be their last time. The air smelled of soot and unwashed cloth, but also something faintly sweet, promise. She sat up, brushing bits of straw from her skirt. A distant rooster crowed, throaty, defiant, barely alive, and soon after came the padded shuffle of bare feet on warped floorboards. Ruth, the girl with braids, appeared in the doorway holding a dented tin cup of water, which she placed silently by Eleanor's side. She didn't meet her eyes, just nodded and left. Outside, the yard was still cloaked in gray dawn, chickens scratched at nothing, and a lonely breeze lifted dust like memory. Eleanor sipped the water slowly, then rose and smoothed her dress. She walked outside, blinking against the cold brightness, and found Sam stacking kindling near the woodpile, his arms thin but practiced. He glanced up only briefly. "Fire's dying." She nodded. "You've been up long?" "Didn't sleep." There was nothing more to say. Not yet. Eleanor bent down, gathered what she could carry, and followed him back inside. Together, they rekindled the fire, boiled what remained of yesterday's stew, and roused the others one by one. The children came to life like reluctant candles, eyes blinking, limbs stretching, silence breaking only in yawns and coughs. Eleanor set them to simple tasks. Marcus and Joseph, the twins, were sent to gather eggs, though they returned with none. "They ain't laid in days," Joseph muttered, and Eleanor only nodded. The hens were too thin, too anxious. Ruth helped sweep the dirt floor, her motions quick and angry, as though erasing something no one else could see. By mid-morning, Eleanor had already mended 2 torn dresses, stirred the pot twice, and pried a rusted nail from the porch that had been threatening bare feet for who knew how long. She worked not from habit, but from necessity, each small task a stone laid on a road she wasn't sure she could walk. That afternoon, a wagon appeared in the distance, creaking slowly up the long path from the main road. It was drawn by a sway-backed mule and driven by a white man with skin like smoked leather and a gaze sharp enough to split wood. He didn't stop at the fence, just pulled the reins hard and let the mule halt itself. "You the woman?" he asked, squinting beneath his hat. Eleanor stepped forward, shoulders square. "I am." He spat to the side. "You don't belong here." The children had gathered behind her, quiet and tense. Sam stood beside her, fists clenched, though his shoulders trembled. Eleanor didn't blink. "I was invited," she said. "By a dead man," the driver replied. "No ring on your hand, no papers to your name. Those children aren't yours." Eleanor felt the weight of the letter in her apron pocket, the one signed by James Bell. It wasn't a legal contract, not by any means, but it had been written with more truth than most court orders she'd ever heard of. "I feed them, I clothe them, I'll keep them." The man laughed, a dry, humorless bark. "We'll see how long you last, or how long they stay." He snapped the reins, and the mule turned, trudging back down the path without another word. That night, Eleanor sat at the table after the children had gone to bed, her fingers wrapped around a cold tin cup of bean broth. Sam joined her after a while, sliding into the seat across from her. He didn't speak at first, just stared into the fire. "Who was that man?" she asked. "Mr. Gable," Sam said. "Owns the big cotton spread down the valley. Said Pa owed him for the mule he never returned." "Did he?" Sam shrugged. "I don't think so, but folks like him don't need truth, just land." Eleanor nodded slowly, absorbing the shape of the threat. She didn't need to be told twice. James's name might have been written on the letter, but no judge in the county would grant her guardianship without a marriage certificate, a will, or a miracle. That evening, she walked the perimeter of the property with a lantern in one hand and the other hovering near her apron pocket where the letter remained. The land was dry, the crops long dead. Only the outline of a forgotten garden remained, a ghost of vegetables and weeds. Near the back of the house, she found a small wooden marker, nearly swallowed by overgrowth. Someone had carved Jenny into it, uneven but deep. Eleanor knelt, brushed away the weeds, and whispered a promise without knowing the words. The soil was too hard for tears. The days that followed settled into a rhythm both bone-tired and oddly holy. Each morning, she rose before the sun, warmed water for washing, and taught the children to recite letters. In the afternoon, they weeded the yard, repaired a leaning fence, boiled soup with whatever scraps could be coaxed from the land. At night, she read from the single book James had left on the mantel, a leather-bound Bible, its pages marked by soot and oil. Slowly, the children began to unbend. The twins giggled again. Ruth started humming when she stirred the pot. Sam offered to chop wood without being asked. Even the baby, still unnamed, laughed one morning when Eleanor tickled his feet during a diaper change. But there was always the edge, the weight of something unsaid. Eleanor found it one evening in the chest beneath the bed. A journal. James Bell's handwriting, familiar now, filled half the pages. He had written about each child, their fears, their first steps, the way Ruth used to sing to Jenny before bed. And in one entry, dated 3 days before his death, he had written, "If Eleanor comes, I want her to know. This house needs her more than I ever did." She closed the book gently, hands trembling. It wasn't a legal document, but it was a testament. When she returned to the main room, the children were gathered around the table, waiting for supper. The pot boiled slowly, and the air smelled of onion and herbs. She looked around the room. The mismatched chairs, the cracks in the floorboards, the broken window patched with cloth, and something in her shifted. This wasn't a temporary stop. This was the edge of something real. Ruth looked up from the bowl she was stirring. "Will you leave?" she asked, so softly it was almost swallowed by steam. Eleanor knelt beside her. "No," she said, "not unless they carry me." That night she wrote a letter by candlelight. Not to her kin, she had none. Not to the law, they would not listen. It was to herself, to the fire, to the broken earth. "I am not their mother," she wrote, "but I will be their home." And for the first time in years, Eleanor slept in a bed. Not because it was hers, but because it was earned. By the time the frost began to retreat from the early morning fields and the sun lifted itself cautiously over the tree line, Eleanor had begun to know them, each of the children, not just as names or mouths to feed, but as small, living stories with invisible bruises and trembling roots. There was more than hunger in their eyes. There was memory. There was mourning. But now, 3 weeks since her arrival, there was also something else. a flicker of trust as fragile as it was undeserved. It started with small things. Ruth began humming again, quietly, when she stirred the stew, her voice just barely louder than the bubbling pot. Joseph and Marcus, the twins, began competing over who could sweep the porch better or carry more firewood without dropping it. Even Sam, guarded and bone-tired, had begun to speak without being asked. The baby, still unnamed but affectionately called Boo by the others, reached for Eleanor when he cried. She took him without hesitation each time, but with familiarity came the uncovering of wounds. Some were obvious, like the scar on Marcus's shoulder, which he never explained. Others were subtle. Ruth flinching when a voice rose too quickly, or Joseph hiding bread crusts in his pillowcase as if food might vanish in the night. These weren't just orphans. They were survivors, each carrying the silence of someone they had already lost. Eleanor devoted herself to the rhythm of their days. In the mornings, she taught them to read from an old primer she found buried beneath a pile of quilts. By afternoon, they worked together mending fences or digging in the stubborn earth of what she hoped might one day be a garden. At dusk, she told stories. Not fairy tales, but true ones, of places she had never seen, cities she would never visit. The children listened with wide eyes and open mouths, as if her words could stretch the walls of their little world. The first real laughter came on a Thursday when Joseph, trying to impress Eleanor by catching a chicken bare-handed, tripped and rolled headfirst into the coop. He emerged with a mouthful of feathers and indignation, while Marcus nearly fell over laughing. Even Sam allowed himself a crooked smile, though he quickly turned away. Ruth looked to Eleanor to see if it was permitted to laugh like that, and when Eleanor nodded, she joined in, a sound rusty and beautiful. One evening, while folding blankets near the hearth, Eleanor found a faded ribbon tucked inside one of the quilts. It was yellowed with age but clean, embroidered with the name Jenny in uneven red thread. Ruth saw it in her hands and froze, her expression tight. "She slept with that," Ruth said, her voice flat. "Wouldn't sleep without it." Eleanor didn't ask questions. She folded the ribbon gently, kissed it, and placed it on the mantel beside the old Bible. That night, Ruth came to her and sat at the foot of her bed. "Jenny was my sister," she said. "She was 6. Got a cough one night. Just wouldn't stop. We had no medicine. Pa tried, but—" She didn't finish. Eleanor reached out and took the girl's hand. It was cold and stiff, like she was afraid to feel anything too long. "We buried her behind the coop," Ruth added. "Me and Sam, no preacher, just us." Eleanor nodded. "You did right by her." Ruth's chin trembled, and for the first time since Eleanor had arrived, the girl let herself cry. Not loud or desperate, just soft, like letting water out of a cup too full. Eleanor pulled her close, holding her until the shaking stopped. Later that week, Eleanor sat with Sam while he sharpened a dull knife on a river stone. "You never told me about your mother," she said. Sam didn't look up. "Don't remember her. Ruth does." He nodded. "She was kind, quiet, didn't talk much. White folks said she wasn't right in the head. Pa said she was just tired of not being heard." Eleanor let the silence settle before she spoke again. "And your father?" "Not my real one," Sam replied. "None of us are his real ones. He just found us." She waited. "After the war, folks left behind a lot of things," Sam said. "Babies, children, no place to go. Pa took us in, said we didn't have to be blood to be family." Eleanor felt the words settle in her chest like a key in a lock. She had come expecting a man, a house, maybe a few children. She had come seeking a life. Instead, she had found a grave, a hollow home, and 7 souls who'd never been anyone's priority. And still, she stayed. That weekend, a letter arrived, folded neatly and pressed into her hands by a local boy on a borrowed mule. Eleanor opened it slowly. The county seal stared up at her, embossed and official. Inside, the words were cold and final. The children of James Bell were not legally adopted, and therefore fell under the jurisdiction of the county as wards of the state. An inspection would be scheduled within the month to determine their placement. Eleanor had no standing, no marriage, no blood ties. She had no legal right to them. The paper trembled in her hands. Not from fear, she had known this would come, but from rage. How easy it was to undo a family with ink. How simple to separate hearts with stamps and signatures. That night, she didn't sleep. She paced. She prayed. And when the sky began to pale in the east, she made her decision. She would not let them go. At breakfast, she told them, gently but firmly. "There will be men coming," she said. "They will ask questions. They will try to decide where you belong." Ruth's spoon clattered to the table. Joseph stared down at his plate. Even the baby seemed to sense the shift in air. "We belong here," Sam said quietly. Eleanor looked him in the eye. "Yes, but we have to make them believe it." They spent the next days preparing, cleaning, repairing. Eleanor ironed the children's best clothes, though none of them fit properly. She taught them to answer questions clearly. She practiced with them, as if preparing for a test that measured not knowledge, but love. One evening, as she tucked Boo into the cradle, Sam came to her with something wrapped in cloth. He held it out with both hands. "Pa's ring," he said. Eleanor unfolded the cloth. Inside was a simple band of silver, dull with age. "He was going to give it to you. Said you might not want it, but you'd deserve it." She stared at the ring, her throat tightening. "I ain't saying you gotta pretend," Sam added. "Just, maybe it helps." Eleanor slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit too well. That night, Ruth came into her room, holding the yellow ribbon. "We want you to keep it," she said. "Jenny would have liked you." Eleanor took it, unable to speak. She tied it around her wrist and didn't take it off. Days passed, then a week, then 2. The letter sat folded on the mantel, a quiet threat. The inspection date had not yet been set, but the shadow of it loomed over every meal, every bedtime story, every laugh that sounded too loud. Still, they lived. They grew. Eleanor planted herbs by the window. Joseph learned to read. Marcus stopped hiding food. Ruth laughed freely now, sometimes even teasing Sam. Boo began babbling nonsense and clinging to her skirts. The house, once hollow, now breathed. One night, Eleanor found herself writing again. Not to anyone, just words on paper. "I have no title, no right, but I have them, and they have me." She folded the paper and tucked it under the Bible. Then she went to bed, holding Boo close, the ribbon still tied at her wrist and the ring warm on her finger. Outside, the wind stirred the fields, and the stars blinked like old friends. The house stood, not by law, but by love. And love, Eleanor decided, was enough. The first sign was smoke, rising thin and dark just beyond the eastern ridge where no one lived and no fires belonged. Eleanor saw it while pulling clothes from the line one morning, the wind cool against her cheeks as the linen danced above her. She paused, squinting toward the tree line. At first, she thought it might be someone clearing brush or burning old stumps, but something about the color unsettled her. Chimney smoke was gray. This was different. Darker, thicker, like something watching. She didn't mention it to the children. Not at breakfast, not at chores. The house had begun to hum with a kind of fragile peace she was terrified to disturb. Boo was crawling now, pulling himself clumsily across the floorboards with determination only the smallest seemed to possess. Ruth was teaching Lily to read, her finger guiding the girls over faded letters in the old primer. Joseph and Marcus had spent the morning racing wooden carts they'd carved from leftover firewood. The air was light, the laughter real, and Eleanor couldn't bring herself to bring fear into it. But Sam saw the smoke. He always did. He came in late that afternoon, arms full of kindling, sweat clinging to his brow, and paused in the doorway without a word. "That's not chimney smoke," he said after a beat. "It's too dark." Eleanor wiped her hands on her apron and stepped outside with him. Together they stood on the porch, staring at the distant thread of black rising above the trees. "How often do riders come this way?" she asked. "Hardly ever." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. They both understood what smoke that color meant. Someone was nearby. Someone watching. That night, she let the stew boil longer and told Ruth to keep Boo close. The younger boys picked up on the tension quickly, their play quieter, glances flicking often to the windows. The air inside the cabin thickened, the warmth of the fire no longer comforting but heavy, pressing against their shoulders like warning. After the children slept, Eleanor wrapped herself in the shawl James had left behind and stepped onto the porch. The sky was wide and sharp above her, stars like glass scattered over velvet. The wind had died down, leaving the night too still. Sam joined her without being called. "You thinking what I am?" he asked. "That someone's come," she replied. "Maybe for me, maybe for the land." "Pa never said he owed nobody," Sam said, voice low. "Debts don't always come on paper," she murmured. "Some come in boots and spit and smoke." He looked at her then, not with fear, but with the steady gaze of a boy who'd seen more than most grown men. "You'd leave if it meant keeping us safe?" She turned to him fully. "I'd fight first." He studied her face a moment, something softening in his own. "You don't look like a fighter." "That's what makes it work." A flicker caught her eye just past the pine line. Movement. A man. Tall, mounted, hat low over his face. He didn't approach, just watched. Then disappeared again behind the trees. Eleanor didn't sleep that night. Instead, she wrote a letter by candlelight. Not to anyone back east, there was no one left, but to the land, the woods, the wind. She wrote of the children, of their faces when they laughed, of Boo's quiet gurgle as he fell asleep against her chest, of Ruth's quiet strength and Sam's burdened shoulders. She wrote, "If I fall, let them say I came empty-handed and still made a home." At dawn, the smoke was gone, but so were 2 hens. The woodpile had been trampled, logs scattered and split, though none taken. It was a message, a warning. Someone had come close enough to smell their breakfast and taste their fear. Eleanor gathered the children close that morning. They peeled potatoes in the sun while she told stories of faraway places, of red rock canyons and snow-covered mountains, of trains that never stopped and rivers wide enough to lose yourself in. But in the corner of her apron, she tucked the broken latch she'd found hanging from the barn door. Because even here, even in this sanctuary they had clawed from nothing, there were men who didn't like when women built without permission. Later that week, while she was gathering eggs, a rider approached. No dust cloud announced him. No noise. Just the steady, deliberate sound of hooves on dry earth. She turned slowly as he dismounted, tall and weathered, wrapped in a duster stained by miles. He didn't move like someone seeking trouble. He moved like someone who had already lived through it. "I'm looking for Richard Walker," he said. Eleanor's heart skipped. It took her a second to respond. "He's not here," she replied, steady as she could. "He died 2 weeks ago. Snake bite." The man took off his hat, nodded solemnly. "That's what I feared." He looked at her carefully, studying not just her face, but the way she stood, the home behind her, the worn apron and work-calloused hands. "And you are?" "Eleanor," she said. He gave a tight nod. "Warren Walker, his brother." A silence fell between them, deep and uncomfortable. Sam stepped onto the porch, eyes narrowed. "He never said he had a brother." "That sounds like him," Warren muttered. "We didn't part on kind terms." Eleanor stood taller. "Why are you here now?" He reached into his satchel and pulled out a worn ledger, nearly identical to the one Eleanor had found beneath the floorboards. Same fabric binding, same uneven stitching. "He wrote me letters," Warren said, "every month for near 2 years. I never answered, not until the last one came. That one had your name in it." Eleanor felt the earth shift beneath her. "He told you about me?" "Told me he was sending for a woman. Said it wasn't for himself. Said he was dying. Said he wanted the children to have a heart in the house, not just a roof." He looked around again. "Seems you got the heart part covered." Sam stepped forward. "You here to take the land?" "No," Warren said. "I'm here to make sure the promise he wrote down gets kept." He pulled a folded page from the back of the ledger. The handwriting was unmistakably James's. "If I die before she arrives, let her keep the house. Let her raise them if she chooses. And if she doesn't, bury this letter with me and forgive me for hoping." Eleanor stared at the page. Her hands didn't tremble. Her voice didn't falter. "I'm staying." Warren nodded slowly. "Then I'll leave you one thing." From his satchel, he pulled a small iron key and placed it in her hand. "To the safe under the floorboards. It's not much, just the last eggs he ever saved." She didn't ask what he meant. She didn't need to. She felt the weight of it in her palm, and it felt like more than metal. It felt like belief. He left before supper without asking for water or bread, without demanding anything. Sam watched him ride off down the path until he disappeared behind the hill. Then he turned to Eleanor. "He knew he was going," Sam said. "Told me to dig the grave deep and wait by the station, just in case you came." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Didn't want to scare you off," he said. "Didn't want to trap you either." Eleanor touched the key in her apron pocket. "I'm not scared," she said quietly, "and I'm not trapped, but I do want to know something." "What?" "What happened to your ma?" Sam sighed long and low. "She bled out after Jonah," he said. "Like Ruth told you, no doctor, just dust and prayers. Preacher said it was God's will. I think it was being forgotten." Eleanor nodded slowly. "I'm not your mother," she said, "but I'm not leaving." Sam turned his face, eyes glassy and rimmed with rawness. "Even if we don't behave?" "Especially then." The wind brushed past them like the exhale of someone long gone, and in that quiet, under a sky too wide to measure, a boy who had buried more than any child should leaned against a woman he'd only just begun to trust. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She just let him lean. The key was smaller than she expected. Rust kissed its teeth, and the iron felt colder than it should have for something that had been cradled by a warm palm. That evening, after the children were asleep, and Sam had returned to his post on the porch with Ruth curled beside him like a coiled cat, Eleanor knelt by the hearth in the hush of a house still standing on breath and prayer. The room, dimly lit by a single oil lamp, felt tighter than usual, as if it too were holding its breath. She slid aside the same loose board where she'd first discovered James's ledger, her fingers brushing the familiar grain of wood now softened by months of wear. But this time she reached deeper, feeling for the unevenness beneath. Her fingertips struck iron, and her heart thudded in response. The lock clicked open with a sound so soft it might have been mistaken for sighing. The safe's lid creaked as it lifted, revealing not gold or weapons, not food or land deeds, just a stack of carefully folded papers bound together with twine and reverence. Atop them, a letter addressed in James's handwriting, to the woman who says yes, even after she knows. She hesitated, then opened it. If you're reading this, it means I'm gone. And you came anyway. You have more courage than I ever did. I didn't send for you out of loneliness. I sent for you because I knew I was leaving. And I didn't want them to forget what it meant to be held. If you turn around now, I won't blame you. But if you stay, then everything I have, however little, is yours. The land, the name, and if they let you, the children. Not because I chose you, but because I trusted you would choose them. Eleanor read it once, then again. Her hands shook, but not from fear, from something deeper. Recognition, perhaps. Relief. The strange comfort of being seen by someone she had never truly met. Beneath the letter was another bundle wrapped in soft cloth. She untied it and found a small pouch, delicate and lumpy. Inside were 7 buttons, each different, one carved from bone, one from wood, another brass, each worn smooth by time and use. A mother's collection, she realized, keepsakes from baby clothes, remnants of moments too small to remember, but too important to forget. She ran her fingers over them like beads, each one humming with memory. There was no money in the safe, no weapon, but what she held was far more valuable. A man's final hope, a woman's confirmation, a family stitched together not by blood, but by the unbreakable thread of decision. When she stepped outside, night had crept across the yard. Warren was there, standing near the barn, his hat in his hand, as if he'd been waiting for something more than the sun to set. "You staying?" he asked softly. "Yes," she said, "and not because of a letter." He tilted his head. "Because of them?" She nodded. "Because of me." He looked down for a moment, jaw tight. "You were wrong, you know," she added. His eyes met hers. It wasn't just a roof Richard gave them. It was the first brick of a home, and now I'll build the rest. Warren didn't speak again. He just nodded and walked back into the dark, leaving the silence behind as a kind of benediction. The days that followed settled into a new rhythm. Eleanor began sorting through the house with a sharper eye, finding space where she once saw only clutter. She patched blankets, organized shelves, and cleared a section of yard for vegetables come spring. Ruth took over baking cornbread, Marcus mended a broken stool, and Joseph began collecting rocks to line a path to the well. Even Boo helped in his way, waddling behind Eleanor with a serious expression as he carried pieces of firewood too small to matter, but too large for his little hands. But it was Jonah who changed everything. It began with a cough, dry, sharp, too deep for a child so small. At first, she thought it might be the weather. Then came the fever. By morning, Jonah was clinging to her skirt with flushed cheeks, barely able to hold his spoon at breakfast. She bathed him gently, coaxed him to drink water, hummed songs she didn't know she remembered. But the fever burned hotter. By noon, Ruth had gone quiet, her face pale and drawn. Eleanor reached for her forehead and felt heat there, too. Then Marcus, then Boo. The sickness moved fast like a shadow skipping from rafter to rafter. By sundown, 4 of the children were sick, their small bodies trembling beneath quilts damp with sweat. Eleanor didn't sleep. Her hands blistered from stoking the fire, her voice cracked from whispering lullabies. She brewed bitter tea from pine needles, 4 spoonfuls of broth between the chapped lips, rotated cloths from foreheads to basins and back again. The worst moment came when Boo stopped crying. No whimper, no moan, just silence. Eleanor held him against her chest, rocking back and forth in the dim light of dawn, heart pounding in rhythm with each shallow breath from the child who had no memory of a mother's touch until she arrived. Warren returned that morning with a sack of potatoes and salted meat, expecting nothing more than a quick drop-off. But one look at the porch, quieter than it should be, boots unmoving by the door, and he dismounted without a word. "They're burning up," Eleanor said, voice hoarse. "I've done all I can. If the fever breaks wrong—" Warren didn't finish her sentence. He didn't offer comfort. He offered help. Together, they moved the children into the main room, built a steam tent with boiled water and wool blankets, and forced liquids past clamped jaws. Eleanor sang when her hands could no longer hold a cup. She kept them alive through sheer stubbornness, as though daring the sickness to defy her will. Sam, the last to fall ill, held on the longest, helping until he could no longer stand. When Ruth collapsed in the wash basin, her eyes rolling back, Sam looked at Eleanor with a face drained of all boyhood. "Is she gone?" he asked. "Not yet," Eleanor replied, pressing her forehead to Ruth's, "and not today." On the 4th night, Eleanor dropped to her knees beside the fire and prayed out loud to no one in particular. Her voice was ragged. "Don't take them. Take anything else. But not them." The fire, which had been struggling for hours, surged. That was the turning point. Ruth opened her eyes first, dazed but breathing. Jonah mumbled something about bread. Boo whimpered and reached for Eleanor's face. Sam, too weak to smile, whispered, "You stayed." "There was never a day I wouldn't," she answered, tears spilling without shame. That night, she didn't sleep in a chair or by the hearth. She lay down on the floor with the children in her arms, their breaths slow and steady, their dreams undisturbed. She was no longer a stranger. She was no longer just a name in a letter. She was mother, not by blood but by fire, and by the long quiet after fever finally breaks. But news in Rosewood traveled like wind, and it carried with it both truth and trouble. By week's end, 2 riders arrived at the cabin unannounced. Eleanor saw them from the porch, neatly dressed, confident, and too clean for anyone local. One wore a sheriff's star. The other held a leather satchel. She didn't have to ask who they were. Sam stepped outside beside her, the rifle, unloaded but not irrelevant, slung over his shoulder. The taller man dismounted first. "We heard the bride showed up," he said, sneering at her, "but no wedding means no rights. These children, well, they're unclaimed. You've got no legal name here." Eleanor didn't flinch. "I have a letter, a ledger, witnesses." The shorter man grinned. "That might hold in town, but you're out here. This land was in debt. Your husband never paid it off. Now that he's gone, the children are wards of the county. We're here to escort them back, for proper placement." The door creaked open behind her. Sam stepped forward. Ruth followed, barefoot, arms crossed like iron across her chest. "We're not going anywhere," Sam said. "She's our family now." "That's not your decision, boy," the taller man snapped. "Then whose is it?" Ruth asked, eyes like steel. "Pa's dead. Ma's buried. and this woman stayed when she could have run. Eleanor placed a hand on each of their shoulders. "You'll do no taking today," she said. "This house may not have a title carved in stone, but it was built by hands that bled for it. And these children, they're not lost, they've been found, and they're not going with anyone but each other." The men stepped forward, but Warren appeared at the edge of the barn, shotgun resting casually across his arms. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The silence behind him was enough. The men backed down. They spit dust and muttered about paperwork, sheriffs, and judges. But they left, because even cowards know when a house stands too firm to shake. Eleanor turned to Sam, who had not lowered the rifle. "You stood for me," she said. He nodded. "You stood for us first." And that was how the house stood, not with locks or land deeds, but with shoulders square and feet planted, not because a man chose a woman, but because a woman chose them all. The snow came early that year, curling over the hills like slow smoke, quiet and consuming. It came not in great storms, but in persistent silence, flakes layering on flakes, days folding into each other like pages left unread. By the time November yielded to December, the porch creaked beneath its weight, and the trees bent low with resignation. The wind carried no malice, only memory, and the cold had learned to whisper through the cracks of every wall. But inside the house, the fire never went out. After the confrontation with the county men, after the shotgun's quiet threat and the children's unwavering defense, something inside Eleanor shifted. Not like a revolution, but like a root finally finding water. She no longer questioned whether she belonged. She no longer counted the days since her arrival or feared the knock of authority at the door. What she had was not official, not ratified or notarized, but it was real. She began to change the house not as a guest rearranging another's space, but as a woman settling into her own skin. She took down the crooked shelf above the hearth and replaced it with one Sam helped her carve from a fallen pine, sanding the edges smooth and oiling the wood until it gleamed in firelight. She stitched curtains from old feed sacks and dyed them with beets and berries, hanging them with rusty nails. She cleared the old corner where broken chairs had once been piled and turned it into a reading nook with a patchwork quilt and a stool stacked high with books sent from the preacher's wife. She stitched quilts late into the night, using scraps of fabric from the trunk she had once packed for marriage. Pieces of her past now blanketed her future. When Boo grew restless, she hummed lullabies without words, pressing her cheek to his hair and rocking until his breathing fell into rhythm with her own. The children began to refer to their tiny cabin not as the house, but simply as home. They fell into a life that was theirs alone, built from scratch, stitched with care. Ruth took to the kitchen as if born there. She learned to bake cornbread with a steady hand, flouring the table in neat, practiced strokes. Her voice, once small and sharp, grew firm. She scolded the twins when they snuck honey from the jar, but kissed their scraped knees afterward. She sang softly as she cooked, sometimes humming the tune Eleanor had first heard her murmur over boiling beans. The song had no name, only rhythm. Sam, taller now, worked harder than any boy his age should. He split wood before the sun rose and again after it set, his shoulders widening, his hands roughened. He fixed the hinges on the barn door, sharpened the kitchen knives, and taught Marcus how to start a fire with only flint and patience. He said little, but when he did speak, his words had gravity. He had stopped asking if she would stay. He knew. The garden, buried beneath snow now, had once shown signs of life before the frost. Potatoes, a handful of onions, a single stubborn tomato plant that had fought until the last frost. In the spring, she would expand it. She marked the space with rocks Joseph had collected, each one painted by the children with bright streaks of color that stood against the white as if daring the cold to forget them. But it was the arrival of Liza that reminded Eleanor how far they'd come. She appeared one evening near the end of December, barefoot and shivering at the edge of the gate. A girl no older than 16, her dress threadbare, hair matted, and arms wrapped tightly around a bundle of cloth that turned out to be a baby no more than a few months old. Her lips were cracked, her eyes hollow, and her steps hesitant, like someone who had knocked on too many doors and been turned away from all. Eleanor saw her first and stepped forward without hesitation. She didn't ask questions. She didn't demand explanation. She simply opened the door, pulled her inside, wrapped her in a quilt still warm from the fire, and whispered, "You're not late. You're right on time." The girl collapsed into her arms, sobbing without sound. Ruth took the baby gently, checked for fever, and began warming goat's milk over the stove. Sam stood nearby, arms crossed but eyes soft. Joseph fetched a bucket of water, and Marcus brought clean cloths. No one asked her name until she was ready to give it. Liza. That was all she said at first. Liza and her baby, whose name she hadn't yet chosen because she hadn't dared to hope he would live long enough to need one. She cried herself to sleep that night on a bed of folded blankets. When she awoke, Ruth had laid out bread and honey, and Eleanor sat beside her with a quiet smile. "You're not here to be saved," she told her. "You're here to remember what it feels like to matter." Liza stayed. She mended clothes with Ruth, helped Sam patch the barn roof, and learned to bake by watching. She didn't talk much, but when she did, the baby always stirred, as if his heart had memorized her voice before his ears had. They celebrated Christmas with hand-carved gifts and laughter. Joseph whittled a top for Boo. Ruth made a doll for Liza's baby out of corn husks. Eleanor received a necklace of buttons, 7 of them, just like the ones she kept hidden in the safe, strung on twine by Marcus with help from Ruth. Each button was different, mismatched, but together they formed a kind of order. A story, a family. Warren stopped by once more in late January, bringing a crate of apples and a note from the preacher, a donation of dried fruit and books tied with twine. He stayed the night this time, bunking in the barn despite the cold. The children gathered around him after supper, eager for stories of places beyond the ridge. After they'd gone to bed, Eleanor found him sitting by the fire, watching the flames with a quiet that no longer felt like burden. "She's doing well," he said, nodding toward the sleeping Liza. "You've built something here." "I didn't do it alone." "No," he agreed, "but they wouldn't have stood a chance without you." Eleanor didn't respond. She only looked around the room, the patched curtains, the pile of boots by the door, the firelight dancing across the smiling face of Ruth as she slept with her arm draped protectively over Liza's baby. "What do you call it?" Warren asked after a pause. "This?" she asked. "A home?" By February, the snow began to retreat in slow, dripping intervals. Icicles melted from the eaves. The creek at the edge of the property began to hum again. Sam planted tomato seeds in the soft corner of the yard where his father had once drawn plans for a chicken coop. Ruth taught Liza how to mend boots and hold a baby without fear. Joseph began carving a wooden sign to hang above the door. It read, "Bell House." Not for James. Not just, but for what he had started. For the root that had grown into tree and then into shelter. Eleanor never remarried. She never left the ridge. She kept the letter from James folded in her apron pocket, and the 7 buttons in a jar by the window. She stitched new ones for Liza's baby and for the girl who came after her, a woman with haunted eyes and bruises under her sleeves who arrived in early spring and stayed because no one asked why she'd run. The neighbors stopped asking who the mother was. The preacher stopped mailing questions. He sent seeds instead. One evening, as the sun stretched long shadows across the porch and the children's laughter echoed down the path, Eleanor took out the old ledger and opened it to the final page. She dipped her pen and wrote slowly, carefully, with the grace of someone whose words no longer trembled. Eleanor Hale Bell, head of household, by heart if not by law. She folded the book and placed it back on the mantel. Then she stepped outside, where Ruth sat whittling, and Sam leaned against the porch rail with a smile that had finally learned how to stay. The wind had changed, warmer now, softer, like spring had taken one small step forward. Eleanor breathed it in and whispered to no one, "Let it come." The frost that had once blanketed the earth began to lose its grip, but winter lingered as if unwilling to surrender what it had claimed. Snowdrift still clung to the north side of the house, stubborn and quiet, while the south-facing fence posts emerged from the white like weary soldiers returning from a long campaign. Though the wind was no longer cruel, it remained sharp enough to remind them of what they had survived. Inside the house, life had not paused. If anything, it had rooted deeper. Each morning began with the scrape of chairs across the floor, with the baby's muffled giggles as Boo chased after the dog that Liza had brought home, a scruffy, one-eyed creature the children named Thimble. Sam rose before the sun most days, stacking firewood with a kind of quiet intensity that came not from duty, but from understanding. Ruth managed the kitchen now with practiced ease, commanding the space as if it had always been hers. Liza, though still young herself, had found the rhythm of motherhood, and often sang lullabies under her breath that her baby seemed to recognize before the first note fully escaped her lips. Eleanor moved among them like breath through the house. She mended hems, stirred pots, and settled arguments before they became fights. She knew the rhythm of each step on the floorboards, could tell which child was coming by the weight and cadence. Her hands were rougher now, her shoulders stronger. There were more lines around her eyes, but they spoke of laughter more than worry. The neighbors, who once looked with suspicion, now stopped by to trade. One with a sack of cornmeal, another with a spool of thread. The preacher no longer sent only verses and cautions, but seeds and books and notes that simply read, "For your schoolroom." Some families from beyond the hills began to send their daughters to spend afternoons with Ruth, who had become something of a teacher by accident. Sam helped them learn their letters, though he often claimed he didn't care much for books. When pressed, he would smile and mutter, "I care about them reading, not myself." They had stopped being orphans. They had stopped being a story whispered about on front porches or a shameful curiosity passed over by church folk. They had become what they were always meant to be, just a family. And so, when the 2 men returned, this time on horseback with papers rolled and stamped and bound with red wax, no one was surprised. Not Eleanor. Not Sam. Not even Ruth, who stood at the door, arms crossed, the rifle leaning beside her like punctuation. The taller of the 2 dismounted first, boots crunching against the thawing earth. "We've got a judge's order," he announced, unfolding the document with exaggerated ceremony. "The county reviewed the case. The Bell children are still unclaimed by legal guardian. The land was never formally deeded, and this residence, while generous in intention, is not recognized by any legal authority. We're here to remove the minors for proper placement in state care." The second man didn't speak. He only nodded, his hand resting near the revolver on his hip. Ruth didn't move. She looked the first man in the eye and said, with a steadiness that startled even Eleanor, "We've got a mother." There was no shout, no dramatic protest, just 5 words spoken plainly, like truth laid bare. Behind her, the children gathered. Joseph stepped forward, holding Boo's hand. Marcus flanked Liza, who cradled her child close to her chest. Sam stood beside Eleanor, taller now than she remembered, his face unreadable but unmoved. The man hesitated. His hand hovered over the paper again, like he needed to remind himself of its power. "We'll come back," he said at last, "with deputies if needed." "No," Eleanor replied, "you won't." The second man looked toward the barn, where Warren stood, leaning against the door frame, arms folded, shotgun visible but not aimed. Neither man reached for their weapons. They turned. They left. The wind closed the gate behind them. That night, Eleanor lit a single candle and opened the ledger once more. Its pages were worn, smudged in places. The ink faded where children had run their fingers over the names too many times. She read each one silently. Samuel, Ruth, Marcus, Joseph, Lillian, Jonah, Boo. And now, beneath them, Liza's son, whose name she had finally given that morning, Isaac, after her grandfather, the one who had taught her how to mend shoes and find meaning in simple things. She dipped her pen and wrote, careful as always, "This family was not made by law. It was made by love. And love, once chosen, is a law unto itself." In the weeks that followed, the ground softened and green things began to fight their way to the surface. Sam's tomatoes broke through the soil. The plum tree near the well began to bud. Ruth painted the porch railing a shade of blue that matched the sky just before dawn. Liza laughed more freely now, her smile reaching her eyes. The house itself changed. A swing was added to the porch, where Eleanor rocked Boo in the evenings. The garden expanded, and behind the barn they built a small coop. The chickens arrived in spring, as if summoned by the plans James Bell had once drawn in the back of his journal. By April, the name Bell House wasn't just something the children said, it was something others said too. It was where people came for bread, for lessons, for warmth. They stopped asking who the mother was, because everyone knew. One afternoon, while Ruth was teaching a pair of local girls how to mend a dress, Eleanor sat beneath the plum tree with a cup of tea and the necklace of buttons Marcus had made for her. She ran her fingers over each one. 7 symbols of 7 first choices, none of which had been hers by birth, but all of which had been chosen by hand and heart. The house hummed behind her, alive with footsteps and voices, the banging of pots, the bark of thimble chasing chickens. There were no locks on the door. There never had been. The only protection they had ever needed had come from within, threaded through the laughter, the labor, the shared fire, and shared burdens. That evening, Sam returned from the field with dirt on his hands and a smile he tried to hide. "The tomatoes are coming in thick," he said. "We'll need more baskets." "We'll build them," Eleanor replied. Later that night, after the dishes had been washed and stories had been told, Eleanor returned to the ledger. She added one more line, one that she knew might never be seen by any court or clerk, but that mattered more than any document sealed in wax. "If you find this house, know that no one here was born lucky. But each of us chose to stay, chose to love, chose to build, even with nothing. So if you're lost or hungry or unsure whether the world still holds people who won't let go, Come in. There's soup on the fire and a bed in the corner. We've been waiting for you." Years passed. The house changed. More rooms were added. The porch stretched farther. The coop filled with real chickens. But some things never changed. The fire never went out. The sound of feet on wood never ceased. The strength of a woman who had not been chosen by one man, but claimed every day by the family that needed her most, remained. Not by blood, not by law, but by the only truth that had ever mattered. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and check out more powerful stories on our channel. Thanks for watching.